So, if you started playing Vanguard with the overdress format, you are probably familiar with orders. Order cards work kind of like spells, they're used in a lot of decks, and if your deck has kind of a wonky strategy, it is not unusual to have an order complemented to make it a lot more viable. A lot of orders have seen competitive play in overdress, for example if you think about Best Harvest in the Gandiva format, or heck, just look at Elementaria Sanctitude that pretty much every deck runs nowadays. A lot of people often forget that orders actually started in V era, and in V era, orders were bad. One, they were generic, so they didn't really support any specific strategy, and two, they were really overcosted, requiring a lot of counterblast and soul that a lot of decks just couldn't spare because of the costs of their inherent abilities. There were some obvious exceptions, builds like Book Vanquisher sometimes seeing play, but those were far from the general rule about orders in V format. One order in particular really fascinates me because I believe a lot of people forget it exists because they assume it was a Bermuda card. It did drop in a Bermuda set and went completely overlooked because it was made for a specific and really bad archetype that kind of had nothing else going for it, but that card is Lyrical Veil. Lyrical Veil says that you get Soul Blast 2 and discard a copy of itself from your hand, so you need 2 of them to activate its effect. That's already kind of a yikes. It lets you revive 2 grade 2 or less cards from your drop, and then you get to choose any number of your and your opponent's units. You give them Intercept and the ability to intercept from the back row. So what of it? This card looks kind of bad. It just says Soul Blast 2, discard 2, revive 2, and give everything you want Intercept. Sure, that can be helpful, but what of it? Why am I making a video on this? Well, I realized that with the recent release of the Grade 2 Cyclers, like Deep Jelly over here, playing Lyrical Veil has become a lot more realistic. Because of the ability of Grade 2 Cyclers, you're able to discard them when your Vanguard is Grade 1 or less, check top 5, and add another Grade 2 or less card to your hand. It is made to fix your ride, technically, but it doesn't specify you have to add a unit. So you can add an order card, like a second copy of Lyrical Veil, to use its effect. But even then, why would we ever want to run a bad order card that says revive 2 from drop? To understand that, we're going to have to look at another bad card that I absolutely adore. It's going to be V-Series Wing Reijy. In my opinion, V Reijy was designed with Grade 4 Guestie in mind, when a lot of Grade 4 Guestie builds were focusing on copying 2 Grade 3s that relied on having a lot of cards in Soul to be able to, expand the design space in Dark Irregulars. The design team attempted to make a Grade 3 card that does not require Soul, so you had the option of going with copying NLK or copying Grade 3 Guestie with some other backup card, and you also had the option of going for 2 copies of Reijy, soul charging your whole deck and getting to 15 in bind, and then attacking your opponent and poking them for 4 damage, leading to a really interesting build where technically your opponent would be dead the second they are at 2 damage, but before that they're actually chilling and your deck kind of does nothing else and dies to itself a turn later. It would have been really, really funny. Unfortunately, Grade 4 Guestie got hit, so we were stuck working with this guy in V and in Premium formats. In Premium, getting his ability to work is a lot more manageable because of all the diverse support we have, but in V it's kind of in a weird area where it tries to do a lot of things but never really succeeds. First, Wing Reijy says that you have to be at 10 or less cards in Soul to activate his first ability. Then you get to Soul Blast one of those cards, choose a card from your Soul and bind it face down, and then his other abilities will count the cards in bind to get some sort of benefit. 5 cards in bind, you get an extra 5,000 power during both players' turns. At 7, you get 10k and a drive during your turn. At 10, you get another 10k and 2 criticals during your turn. And if you get to the mythic 15 cards in bind, on attack, you get to ping your opponent for 2 damage. So this sort of orients the deck towards a kind of a control playstyle. You have a bigger body during your opponent's turn, your Vanguard swing is often going to be lethal, and eventually you'll start chipping away at your opponent's life by dealing them 2 damage every turn. Unfortunately, if you read the card, you will understand that you have to soul charge about 30 cards to activate this ability. If you add to that the cards you will have in hand, in damage, on field, and preferably in deck to be able to do drive checks, you are looking at maybe 1 or 2 turns with 15 cards in bind, which is really not realistic. So you're playing this deck that wants to be control focused, and then wants to pressure your opponent with big Vanguard swings and nothing else, but because of the amount of cards you have to remove from your deck, you're not going to be able to play a control playstyle because you're only going to have 2 or 3 turns on your grade 3. There is, however, a solution, and that solution is reusing the same cards by soul charging from drop, and this is where Lyrical Veil comes in. Today I'm going to be showing you a really weird build where we take grade 3 Reijy with all its flaws, and we try to complement them with this really bad order card, and we're going to try to make a weird mesh and combination kind of to get it to be sort of functional. So without further ado, let's take a look at the deck list to sort of understand a bit more how this is supposed to happen. This deck is not competitively viable, I am warning you. I'm just making this deck profile because I find it really funny that there is finally a use for Lyrical Veil, and I kind of want to get it out of my system so I can start testing serious V Premium DI decks. If you were following me on Twitter, you have probably seen this deck list before, and that is why you should probably follow me on Twitter. That's where I post all the random brain fart moments I have, and all the weird, funny interactions for Dark Irregulars that I happen to stumble upon. First off, we're obviously going to be running 4 copies of Wing Reijy. You already know what he does. Our goal here is going to be to have him at least get to 7 cards in bind on the first grade 3 ride. Like that, we're going to be able to start plussing off of our opponent, and we really want to be playing a slower game with this deck as it is. Because we're going to be soul charging from drop, we don't have to rush and attack the opponent's Vanguard. If they are at 2 damage, we should be able to win the game, and we don't want to give them too much counterblast, because if you look at V decks nowadays, you give them 3 counterblasts and you are probably a goner. The idea here is going to be to swing at your opponent's rearguards as much as possible with Wing Reijy, and sometimes you can even give them the ability to intercept with Lyrical Veil if you want to nudge them into removing their own rearguards on their own. After this, to assist us with the Lyrical Veil playstyle, we're going to be running 3 copies of Variance Drag Forms. We're not running anything to help us get to our grade 3s in this deck. That is why we have a backup right target that can sort of help us do things. Drag Form says that when he is placed on Vanguard or Rearguard, we get to Counterblast 1, put a card from our damage into our soul, so preferably the card you used for the Counterblast, and then we take a grade 2 or greater from soul, add it to hand, put the top card of our deck into the damage zone face down. So he lets us access our damage zone, but most importantly, he also lets us get back copies of Lyrical Veil, because Lyrical Veil is a card and it is grade 2 or greater. After this, to increase our consistency, we're going to be running 4 copies of Deep Gelidus. Deep Gelidus is DI cycle card. We can discard him, check top 5, and add a grade 2 or less if our Vanguard is grade 1 or less, but he also has an ability that synergizes with Reijy even though it's a little slow. He says that when he attacks while boosted, we get to Soul Blast 1, choose one of our units, and search our deck or drop for 3 copies of that card and put them into our soul. So we're going to be using this to recur specific cards from drop. Usually a really good play is to get 4 copies of Reijy out of your deck right away, and then you soul blast them for the ability of your Vanguard Reijy, and then you keep looping those 3 copies with all similar effects. So this guy is going to be able to get the Reijys out and then keep recycling them if we can afford to have an attacker on the sides. But because he has to attack, he is not as good as the next card in this list. 4 copies of Emblem Master. Emblem Master on Rearguard and Guardian gets 5000 power and 5000 shield if you have 7 or more cards in soul. This will usually not happen, but if you know that you need the extra soul, you can sort of slow down with your soul charging plays, keep 7 cards in soul, once you have 5 cards in bind preferably, and benefit from his soul ability. He is mostly interesting for the second skill though. He says that on Vanguard or Rearguard when he is placed, you get to Counterblast 1, choose one of your units, and search your deck or draw of the 3 cards with the same name and put them in soul. So it is exactly the same ability as Deep Gelidus, but only on place, and because of that we get to use it in the main phase to get to a higher cards in bind threshold for the ability of our Reijy during the battle phase. This guy is also going to be our main target for Lyrical Veil. The biggest problem with builds that try to recur cards from drop for Reijy is the fact that, well, you only have so many copies of Emblem Master, and Emblem Master is the kind of card that really likes targeting itself sometimes, because it's a guaranteed 3 soul. Sometimes you will lose specific cards to your hand or to your damage. But with the Lyrical Veil, we get to revive extra copies of him, so we get to trigger him more and more, and we are not going to be hard capped by the counterblast we have, but you're going to have to wait for a moment to understand why. To round up the grade 2 lineup, this is a bit of a flex slot, but I've been finding a lot of fun running Demented Executioner. Demented Executioner says that when he attacks a grade 2 or greater unit, he gets 5k, so this allows us to put our opponent closer to like that 2 damage threshold where we can start poking away with the Reijy ability to win. And he also has the ability that when he is placed on Vanguard or Rearguard, you get to Counterblast 1 and Soul Charge 3, and if you put a trigger in Soul with this ability, you get to draw a card. Often you will be putting a trigger, especially if you deck thinned a little bit with Emblem Master and with Deep Jelly this, but ultimately he is mostly here for turboing Soul early in the game. You could run pretty much any grade 2 in this spot. You could run Poisonic Abductor if you wanted to. I don't like him in this build because he minuses you on hand, and we're already kind of running low on hand. You could also run Blaze Foresight if you're fond of that card, the one that puts triggers from hand to Soul and lets you draw. I think he is a little better because generic Soul is always good in a build that wants to reach certain numbers of cards in Soul. So you've now seen 6 grade 2s that cost Counterblast 1 on place to be able to activate their abilities. Well, how do we get these abilities off? We're going to be doing that by using Lyrical Veil in tandem with this grade 1. So often you're going to be reviving either Demented Executioner, either Emblem Master in combination with Edge in the Darkness. Edge in the Darkness, first off, is a great right target. When placed on Vanguard, you get to draw a card and put a card from hand into your Soul. But he also has the really neat ability that when he is placed on Rearguard, you get to Soul Charge 1, and if he was placed by a card ability, you get to Counter Charge 1. The main use of this skill is to combine him usually with units that place him from deck or from Soul, like Poisonic Abductor or Guild Array, but now we get to abuse this ability by calling him from drop with the skill of Lyrical Veil. He is also not a minus on Soul if we Soul Blast him after writing him for the Lyrical Veil, because on place he will also give us a Soul. So he is a wonderful target overall, and if we just want to countercharge because we already have Emblem Masters in hand, we can also just call 2 copies of Edge if they are available in Soul or in drop. So this is kind of what makes Lyrical Veil playable in Dark Irregulars, the fact that we get a free countercharge and the ability to recur our good grade 2s that counterblast. To finish off this roundup, we're running the classic Reijy grade 1 line, 4 copies of Killer Tail because she lets us access specific cards from drop and from damage, so we can have more efficient Emblem Master and Deep Jelly Dust activations, and she can also become a countercharge if we decide to put in the effort of putting 3 copies of her into Soul, which is kind of doable even though we don't always need the counterblast in this deck. Beyond that, we're going to be running 4 copies of Bestial Squeezer. Bestial Squeezer says that when she's placed on Rearguard, you put a normal unit from drop to the bottom of your deck and Soul Charge 1, allowing you to Soul Charge without minusing on cards in deck, but she also has the really interesting ability that in drop, you get to bind her, choose one of your Rearguards, and put it into your Soul. So if you decided to commit a unit to board, you can then put that unit to Soul to increase your bind count. If you're missing like 1 card in Soul to get to that magical number. That makes her also a really great target to Soul Blast with Reijy's ability if you manage to get her in Soul. Starter, obviously we V-starter because we don't have a choice. Devil in Shadow looks really cool also. And then the trigger lineup is up to you. In my opinion, I like going for 8 crits to potentially make our rearguards lethal after the Reijy swing, so if our opponent is at 3 damage, we get to give the 2 crits we checked to something on rear and get to remove more cards from their hand like that. I'm also running 4 copies of the Draw PG because drawing cards is kind of necessary in this deck sometimes because of how piece reliant you are, and even though you are a protect deck, you will often not be rewriting your Reijys, so having perfect cards is nice. Unfortunately, this makes us kind of prone to deck out, which is one of the things that plays into the fact that this deck is not that good. And to finish it off, we're going to be running 4 copies of the Grade 3 heal. It has more power than the 20k heal, and it also happens to allow us to survive in the early game. And this deck doesn't really care because as long as we have 1 CB and a way to countercharge, we can play the long game. So I hope you enjoyed today's video, even though it was a kind of rambly and low effort. I just kind of wanted to give signs of life because I have not posted in a while. I was working on this kind of detailed NLK deck profile, but I ended up scrapping it because it was bad and not that relevant. So I'm going to be reworking that with a script preferably to make it make a lot more sense. Hope you enjoyed the Reijy deck profile. Again, this deck is not good, but I just wanted to, you know, I just wanted to get it out of my system by posting this online, and at the same time, you know, sharing an interesting build, because there might be actual potential for Lyrical Veil in other decks that I have yet to find. If you enjoyed the video, you can subscribe to the channel, you can leave a like, you can follow me on Twitter. That is probably where I'll be manifesting my presence more often, because I don't always have the time to make content on YouTube, and there's not always stuff to cover that is interesting. And yeah, if you have any thoughts on this build, don't hesitate to leave them in the comments. If you have figured out how to make Reijy actually competitive if playable, please share, because I fucking love that card. I wish it was a lot better. And I guess at this point, I will be signing off. Take care.